Hi, everyone. Welcome to DC. It's good to have DjangoCon here in DC, but I have to say I kind of miss Portland, where it was happening for the last 3 years. But so my talk today is about Django forms in an API world. And you might be thinking about, like, what is up with this picture? And I can tell you what is up with this picture. It's like this guy has no idea what he's doing, you know, and hence that's the situation we have, in my opinion, we have with Django forms in a setup where we're using a lot of API stuff. So let's go ahead and get started. Obviously, let's talk about me first. I work at a small healthcare company in DC. It's called Wiser Together. I'm the lead software engineer, and I've been using Django for about 4 years and Backbone.js for nearly 2 years now. And I would like to talk about how we approached a problem, fundamental problem that we've been experiencing. What can you expect from this talk? So I'm going to go over what's wrong with the forms as it is, how we use forms in web development, what are the issues of using forms in an API world, how we can tackle these issues, and finally the solution. So let's go to the point where we're talking about the good old days. So the good old days, when in terms of APIs, is that you had templates. You would go ahead and write up some HTML and throw that awesome little template tag in there called .sp, and you got your awesome form. But this stage has kind of passed, and fast forward a few years, now you really, really love APIs. So there's something wrong with rendering forms via Django templates, because your setup that you have these days kind of looks like this. You have the He-Man riding the awesome pony, serving API for your consumers, and then you have your website, which is consuming the API, and then you have your mobile devices also consuming the API. So this is the new world of forms. And in this new world, the forms, the Django forms live on the API server, which validates and saves your API requests, but they don't get rendered via templates anymore. And in order to accommodate this, a lot of us, what we have been doing is we've been hard coding HTMLs or whatever else we need in the front end, and we've been trying to match up the form with the API data we're willing to pass over. So let's take a look at the API clients we have. So the website you might have may not live on the same application space as API. Common API clients these days is a fully JavaScript MVC-powered web application. It could be an Android app or an iOS app. Now, forms on API clients. You take a look at this screenshot and you realize that a form is just not something that you see on a website. There are forms on your iPhone. There are forms on your Android device that you use every day. And they're strikingly similar in the way they do things. So what is the issue that we have? You can serve most platforms, like you can serve your web application, you can serve them, you write an HTML app, and then you can serve it on your devices, you can serve it as a web application, and then what you end up doing is that you write forms in HTML in your application. But if you're writing a native application for mobile, then what you end up doing is you recreate the forms using the interface elements available to you. This is rather inconvenient, and we'll discuss why. So the interfaces you write on each of these devices, now I'll start calling the web application itself. The browser can be considered a device. So these applications or these devices don't have any idea about a Django form that's on the API server. And these forms only know what data they need to collect and then send over the API to the API server. So we have a disconnect here. So obviously, we have a problem where we can't drink our beer. So let's take a step back and think about what is a form. Merriam-Webster says a form is a printed or typed document with blank spaces for insertion of required or requested information. In the world of HTML, it's a part of an HTML document with input interfaces for inserting required or requested information. Considering the world of web applications, a form is an interface that we provide to the application user so that we can collect some bits and pieces of information, and it's very essential to any application where we collect data, of course. Now, let's move over to the world of Django, because that's where it really starts to get complex. This is a simple Django form. It's a login form. As you can see, there's an email field, and then there's a password field, and then we have a couple of validation methods, and then some additional methods. So this is a typical form, and we are all very familiar with it. And I absolutely love Django forms because it's this amazing construct that allows you to bind data, validate it, process the data, and then also, like as we know, that it allows rendering as well. There are some additional things of Django forms that are pretty awesome. The model form turns your model into a form, and that's just the easiest way to take your data and get an interface for it. Really, really easy. And then there's widgets, which I particularly like a lot because the widgets separate your data type from the presentation. The character field that you have, a field that accepts characters, can be a password input, or it can be like a text input. So you see how there's a data type, and then there's the implementation of it in the front end. And these widgets allow that separation. So at this point, you might be asking, like, what is wrong with rendering via template? And I'll tell you why. The first problem is that if you're running an API server, you cannot assume your consumers are going to be residing on the same space as the API server. They can be arbitrary. Like I said, they can be iOS devices, Android devices. And the other case is that you might be consuming APIs from several independent Django projects. And in that case, which Django project your website is going to live in? That's a hard question. And we've been trying to answer this because at Wiser Together, we use a similar setup. Look at this picture. There's 3 independent Django projects and 2 independent web applications. And this is a very common scenario where you have an user application. You don't want that to do anything with the admin application. So the application space should be separate fundamentally. And then you have distinct projects serving distinct APIs. So your services are distributed. And web applications we design these days are becoming, they need to be separated from the presentation and data layer by API. And obviously, like I mentioned, they may depend on multiple API endpoints, and they're very rich and complex. So going back to the picture that I just showed you, your site content might be retrieved using a content API, and think about the forms associated with a content API. You need some sort of form to collect feedback on your data or content, and then you need to provide an admin interface to edit that content. Profile API, that's something that people use to, users can use to log in, create, update their profiles, and you might also need an admin interface to manage those profiles. So 2 distinct requirements in terms of forms. And finally, like I mentioned in the picture, Analytics API might be collecting user traffic data, and you might want to provide an admin interface where people go and say, like, oh, okay, here's something I typed in, filter my analytics results by this. So you still have a requirement for admin interface for the Analytics API. So here's the picture for you to think again. If your setup is going anywhere near this, you might face the same problem that we've been having at Wiser Together. We love APIs, and we have distributed our setup. Our content API is different from Profile API, and then there's Analytics API, and then there's finally a fourth piece called Data API, which provides complex statistics for the users to consume. We've been hard-coding forms in our user-facing application. We've been hard-coding content forms, profile forms, and other kinds of forms. And we were kind of getting tired about it, because whenever we were changing a data point in the back end, we had to go and in the front end, we had to update the form. It was very annoying, and we also had multiple clients who required completely different set of fields, say, presented on the registration forms. And so one client said, we don't want zip codes on our forms. Like, how do you handle that? We ended up doing more hard coding in the front end, and it was a complete mess. Okay, moving forward, what could we do? What can we do to prevent this? Like I said, we love Django forms, and we use it to validate and process our API data. Forms are amazing to take data, bind them, validate them, save them however you want. And we also wanted the Django forms to determine our front-end interface over API. So the challenge we faced that the Django form or the front-end interface was completely agnostic about this Django form that lives on the API server, because it doesn't have any way to know. It only knows, okay, this is the hard-coded HTML form. Let's send data over API to the API endpoint. So this is what we wanted to do. We wanted to deliver form definition over API. We wanted to render the interface in the front end using that form definition so that there's no more hard coding, and forms in the application will update as soon as we change the backend form. Now, how awesome would that be? So we also wanted to adjust the form in any way necessary. We wanted to add remove fields on the fly, like for company X, remove zip code, company Y, remove date of birth, and without changing any front-end HTML code, they will be rendered properly. So our goal was to enforce that we don't repeat our code. We don't want to change code in backend, also go change code in front end. So like I said, the goal is to contain form definition is one spot of the single central point to control interface, and just not on our web application, but on all devices that we have, and allow different API consumers to just retrieve that form definition and use it the way they want. So now we get to the solution. And as for any complex problems, you have a three-step solution. So step one, serialize form with all information necessary to reproduce it in the front end. Step two, devise a method to handle the following things over API: delivering form definition, receiving back form data, validating that form, and deliver errors as necessary, and if valid, process the form. And step three, of course, handling the forms in the front end, rendering it, submitting it. If not valid, display the errors. And then if valid, then display success message, or reload the page, or a redirect or something. So let's take a look at the steps in detail. Step one, serializing the forms. In order to accommodate this, we came up with this package called Django Remote Forms, which extracts all information from a given Django form or model form, and then goes through each of the field and widgets to extract information from them as well, presents this information as a dictionary. And now why dictionary? Because it's very easy to manipulate that and convert that into JSON. So using remote forms is absolutely easy. Take a look at this. You instantiate your form, and then you say remote form, and you pass in your form, and then you say give me the dictionary back, and you just call remote form as dict. It will work. It will give you all necessary information and all metadata that's contained in a Django form back to you. Now this is how, when you serialize the form, it looks like that. And you can see it contains some metadata about the form, and it contains the two fields, email and password. It tells you what kind of field it is, what widget it's using, max length, help text, things like that. So you're starting to see how we can take this information and utilize it in the front end. So now going back to step 2, how do we devise methods to handle the API stuff, delivering, receiving? So let's take a look at a little bit more code. You can see this is an example view that handles that remote form, and it accepts form data, it validates, and it processes the form, and it all does it in this little view. I have enabled CSRF exempt because Django CSRF doesn't really like application JSON data. So we're handling CSRF on our own in this little view. You can use the header as well. But you can see, like, if the request is get, deliver the form. So over here, you have, like, you declare the form, you turn it into a remote form, and you pass it over as JSON. If the request has raw post data, because it can be post or put, what you do is, like, you pass in the data from that raw post information, you pass in the required data into the form, and you validate that form, and if necessary, save it, and then also return the response. The form will be returned again. So points to ponder, as I said, like, Django CSRF doesn't like the JSON data. And also, we're trying to promote encapsulation of your form processing logic inside the save method of the form. Now, going over to step 3, which is one of the most difficult part of, like, solving this problem, is that how do you handle this form API definition that you're getting over from your API server? How do you utilize it in the front end? So rendering, submitting, validating, and displaying. So our solution was, we created a set of rendering and data handling tools using these tools. And I think over today and yesterday, you have heard about Backbone a lot. You've heard about handlebars. And I can tell you it's amazing. I love Backbone. Like, at Wiser Together, we use Backbone a lot. And handlebars is really awesome. And the reason we are sending data, form data as JSON, or not delivering HTML, because we want to render that form on an iOS device. If you're just sending over HTML, you're assuming your end device is going to present the interface in HTML. How can you make that assumption? So in order to come up with a construct that will handle this form API data and render it, validate it, and do all the good stuff, we came up with this Backbone model view combination that we call the Backbone form handler. And it renders forms based on API definition. And it uses little handlebars templates for core form structure, for field and widget, and also for error rendering. This Backbone form handler is used. So there's a couple of advanced features of the Backbone form handler is that it allows instant validation. As soon as you move from one field to the other, you can make sure that field gets validated then and there. So by the time a user submits a form, it's already validated, and you know that form is going to succeed. It allows preloading of data. You can supply data that's going to show up in the form. You can prevent editing of certain fields, including selects, radio, checkboxes, etc. And it allows you to put in different kinds of buttons for the form. So this is a structure of handlebar templates that we've been using. Those are tiny little templates. You can see the base form handlebar, and then the error rendering handlebar, and then you see a whole bunch of fields and basically widgets to render text input, date time input, password input, and things like that. This is a sample Backbone view that allows you to do all of that stuff. First, you can see that we rendered the view itself. Then we create a form model. Then we create a form view. And then you can see the model being passed in the view, and we're saying spot check equals true, which will allow the instant validation. And then we insert the form in a container of that view, and we call login form model.fetch. This will go, bring the form, render the form, and get it ready for people to use. There's actually a lot of win in this. I mean, when you finally see it in action, which you will, I promise, you will understand that, like, it's an amazing construct, and it makes your life a lot easy. In order to demonstrate the capacity of this, I wrote up this thing called Django Remote Admin. One of the reviewers, after I submitted my talk proposal, said that, hey, like, it sounds good, can you use remote forms to like make Django admin work over API? And I thought, yeah, why not? So I basically wrote a bunch of API endpoints that exposes like application model and instance data, and then it also exposes the admin forms. And I wrote a backbone application that implements that idea. So the goal of Django Remote Admin is to basically allow you to administrate Django projects over API. That means that like that sucky interface that you've been stuck with for a long time is no longer a problem. And finally, like you can use your own handlebar snippets for each of the fields to spice up your interface, and you're not tied to like Django admin like date time widget or something. So how does this Django remote admin work? So first of all, it cycles through the admin site registry and extracts all the application and model information and exposes that over API. And the next thing it does is that it creates the model forms. It creates model forms from the models and also exposes those model forms, form definitions over API. And finally, the backbone app calls the API, and it gets information about apps and models that allows browsing through the applications and models, and also allows creating and editing of model instances, which I will share with you guys in a second. So there's a lot of work that went into this, and I've been working on this for a while. This is to solve a big problem that we were having at Wiser Together. So, but there are a couple of more things that we need to do. For example, the Django remote form needs a file and image uploading solution. It's kind of a tricky thing to get working over API, but I've been working towards it. And also the Django remote admin could use some more form and widget customization. And I haven't implemented pagination yet, but it's kind of a simple thing to do. You just limit your API endpoints to only show certain things and accept some parameters. So that basically brings me to the end of a good portion of my talk, but I'm going to switch over to the demo now so that I can show you guys how to do this. And you can find these projects on Wiser Together, and like you can follow me on Twitter. A big shout out goes to my coworker Carlo Costino, who's been working really hard to work on the Django remote forms. And you can find the presentation at SlideShare. Let me switch over to my browser for a second. There we go. So this is basically a full-fledged implementation. Not full-fledged, it's like kind of there. Implementation of Django admin, but it's all happening over API. And I'll clear out the request so that you guys can see that there's only XHR requests being passed out. So say like it does validation on the fly. So if I do something like this, so it instantly tells you that that value has to be more than 6 characters. And you can see there was a post made over to the API endpoint to validate the form. Now, if I go back to the username field, you see like the password field now says, hey, this field is required, where are you going? So what I'm going to do is just log in, and the login happens over API as well. So I'm now inside the Django admin, but again, this is the custom implementation of admin, and you can like cruise through admin, different options. Let me go to the users. Very crude. I'm not very good with CSS, but like you get the idea. You have the header and like email, first name, last name, and my user record is in there. So let's get back to some other spots. There's user profiles, which is like a custom model that I wrote. I have 2 profiles for myself. Let's go back. There's a sites app, and then you can go inside sites. You can add a site. What we're going to do is like we're going to go and add a user. So where you will see Django remote forms in place. And this was just built using this form definition. So you can see it returned all the information that I needed for the Django contrib user model. Is staff, is active, is super user, blah, blah. All this information and with initial values and whatnot because they need the initial values. So I'm going to go over there and create a user named Django. And let's give it a password. Django123. And hit save. It says successfully updated user. Should have said successfully created the user. But let's go over to the users menu. You see there's the Django user there now. Now, let's go ahead and give the Django user super user status so that we can log in with that newly created account. So this is showing updating of the of an object, and again, this is constructed dynamically using the form definition that was delivered. And save the user. So now, if we go back to the users list, you can see the last bit is staff. It's been set to true. So I'm going to go ahead and log out. And then log in using the Django user that I just created. There we go. So we have, we just created a user just over API, and like we assigned it to have super user status, and then now I'm logged back in using using that same user. So this shows you how remote form can be used in any way possible. Like I would like to encourage you guys to just go take a look at this. Take a look at this this GitHub repos and hack it any way you want, and hopefully this will be useful to you. What we've been trying to do is separate out the requirement to hardcode HTML in your front end, hardcode in your iOS device. You can just take that form definition now and render it anywhere. And it might be a little Django-y. It will still say char field, but whatever. You can get it like worked out to work on any device because it's just data there. So there we go. Any questions?
So thanks for the very interesting presentation there. I definitely think we have a few projects we'll be looking at this on. One thing I just wanted to start out with a fairly simple question. It looked like those were some very fast API responses you had going there. Have you just seen any difference in the overall responsiveness of your UI after switching to this?
So the API just delivers data. That's why it's a very lightweight. And I guess when you're working in a production setup, what will happen is that you'll get a slight delay before you receive the form. So you'll just have to put in a nice little throbber there until your form loads. And then we're actually just completed moving our registration form, profile update form at Wiser Together all over to a dynamic front end, and it calls and gets the registration form. And like we're using a little throbber, and it works out nicely.
First, I wanted to say that I really liked the validating on the server, so you don't have to duplicate that logic on both the client and the server. I thought that was really nice. My question is, you're not using the Django templating engine, right?
That's true. Everybody hates Django templating engine, so we've been trying to move away from it. And when we turn our Wiser Together site completely over to Backbone, there won't be a single Django template that we'll be using. It's going to be all handlebars.
Okay, so if you were using this to construct a website, then Google's indexing would see JSON, not your actual HTML. Just to make sure I'm clear, like that could be one potential drawback of this, is that you don't the response sent from the server to the client won't be in that HTML format. It has to be processed first by the backbone JavaScript.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So you mentioned that there were some specific problems you were trying to solve when you created remote admin. Would you mind sharing with us what some of those problems were?
So the remote admin was particularly written because, first of all, a reviewer of my proposal, DjangoCon proposal, requested that can you use remote forms to do something cool like remote admin, or like take Django admin, expose it over API. We don't like the interface anymore. So that's why I did it as a proof of concept. The problem we've been trying to solve at Wiser Together has been that we had 3 different Django projects serving 3 different kinds of API, 4 actually, and we had forms that were associated with each of those Django projects. So now, where do we put our website? In what project space do we put our website? And so then we went ahead and tried to do this so that we can get form definitions from each of these projects and render it in one user-facing application. So, you know, like our user-facing application became completely independent of any of this content API, profile API server, or analytics API server. So that was the problem we were trying to solve. Another problem we were trying to solve is that make it future-proof so that these form definitions can be used by an iOS app to render the interface, and it will be changed as soon as we update a Django form in the backend.
So that's for forms, but for the admin, it was really like to present a use for the forms?
Oh, so are you asking like why I did the remote admin or the
Yes.
admin project? Yeah, so it's, a lot of people don't like the traditional admin interface, and they wanted to use their like fancy interface elements, you know, why use Django's calendar, like when you can use something else, and you know, you can style it in any way you want, your fields will be awesome, and you can like validate on the fly. As soon as you move from one field to the other, your data will be validated. So these are like the motivations to, you know, create the remote admin.
Thanks.
Hi. I really like the idea of serializing the form data. I'm wondering, is there, maybe I missed it in the view example, is there a way to take that serialized data and then reload it into a typical Django form since it's got that special metadata in it too? Or?
So you're saying if you can take the remote form and load the data back into a Django form?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's basically what we're doing over the API. First, we get the form information back, and then when we collect the data from the user, we package it in our API response to submit that data. And then, like when the response goes back to the API server, it finds the data in a particular subfield, loads the data into the Django form, and then it does if form is valid, you know, and then it saves the form. So yes, you can completely do that.
All right, thanks.
Hello. I'm
Hi.
curious if you looked into the Rails community. There's certain talk about hyper media APIs, which also address form communication, as well as a few other things that might be useful for the admin.
I did research a bit. I found out that Java has certain capacities of turning, you know, data requirements into interface requirements. It's called reflections, I think. And also, I haven't investigated that much into Ruby, but I know that Ruby has already gone like quite far ahead of us, you know, by providing API endpoints that are created as part of the framework itself. So there's definitely some cool stuff going on in there. But I wanted to like make sure that we as a Django user get to, you know, get somewhere like that as well. So yeah, there were certain you know, inspirations that I got from these other communities as well.
Hi, I'm curious if it's possible, I actually don't know, to overload the as_p function of a form so that when you render it in the template, you can get that those custom attributes. And also, I guess I have another question of, in your experience writing this code, have you had to store any specific attributes for that item or style information within the form that you, I guess, philosophically wouldn't really want to place there? You'd probably want to keep your style information in, say, like a CSS file or something like that.
So are you asking that whether we created our handlebars templates in a way that renders those fields properly, or if I missed the question?
So I guess, would you want to like add any attributes to the particular item on the form, you know, and then you'd have to store that within your form, where typically you would see something like that in the actual HTML file?
So everything you see rendered on the page will be coming from data, and the templates are very generic. They will take help text. They will take, you know, if there are errors, it will accept the errors to display. It will take an initial value. So we utilize that in a maximum way possible, using those little snippets that are responsible for rendering each of the widgets. So we don't really store anything. It all comes and goes from the API server. So there's absolutely nothing that we store. It's always rendered on the fly using the definition that we're getting from the server.
Okay.
At any
So
given time.
also, is there a way to overload the as-p function?
Oh,
of the
right.
form?
The first question.
Right.
Yeah, you can definitely go and, you know, you could write as dict on the form itself, which would basically call remote form, get the form object serialized, then basically return the as dict of the remote form. So you'll just have a base form somewhere in your project that either overrides asp or creates a new function called asdict, where you actually call the remote form, serialize it, give it back. So yeah, you can totally have an asdict on the form and utilize it in your Django templates as well.
Thanks.
Hi. I'm really excited to try it out. It looks really cool. I haven't looked at the code or anything yet. I've struggled before trying to get Django to work with Backbone.js. Just curious, in the code, do you have examples for, like, you know, beyond the admin, because of course the admin is really complicated. Do you have some basic examples to get started using it with Backbone.js or anything like that? Or what's a good resource to start using this?
Actually, the way I wrote the Django remote admin, it's very little code, you know, and I would say the part where it goes and fetches the login, you saw like in the beginning I logged in using a login form. That was completely separate than all the other model forms or instances that were being converted into forms and being sent over. So that login form example is a very simple example. There's a view in the backend, the API endpoint that handles the login form. You can look at that, and you can look at the implementation of the login form on the Backbone side, and it will give you a clear idea of how to set up such a form, render it, and get it working.
Thank you.
Thanks again for the great talk, Tareque, and we'll have a few minutes here while we get the next speaker lined up.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone, for listening.